Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman. A lesson this week from Genesis chapter 21. We'll be reading verses 8 through 21. Story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. Well-known story to most of you, I'm sure. Just some very brief background. Abraham and Sarah have been married for many, many years, never had any children, and God had promised Abraham that he would make him a great nation. At one point, even took him out at night and had him look up at the stars and told him that, can you count the stars? Because that's how many descendants you will have. I'll make your family into a great nation. But they were unable to have a child. And at some point, Sarah became concerned that they would ever have a child. And I guess you could say she started to doubt a little bit in God's promise. We all know that God keeps his promises, but sometimes maybe doubt does come in. And I think that's what was happening with Sarah. And so Sarah went to her husband Abraham and convinced him to have a child with Hagar, and then they would take the child to raise as their own. Hagar was Sarah's attendant, her slave. She was from Egypt. They went through with her plan. Hagar conceived a child, and after the conception, a lot of animosity developed between Sarah and Hagar to the point that they despised one another. Sarah made it very difficult on Hagar to the point that Hagar fled away from Abraham and Sarah and was out in the desert. The angel of the Lord came to her and convinced her to return. Later, Ishmael was born. That was the son by Hagar. Abraham was 86 years old when his son Ishmael was born. But God had made that covenant with Abraham and told Abraham that he was still going to bless Sarah and they would have a child. And they did. And they named him Isaac. God had also said that he would bless Ishmael and it would make him into a great nation. And the scripture tells us that Isaac, when he was born, Abraham was 100 years old, so about a 14-year difference between Ishmael and Isaac, and that pretty much brings us up to the scripture that we're going to read this week. And it says, "The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, 'Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac.' The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, 'Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring.' Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water, gave them to Hagar, and he set them on her shoulders, and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, 'I cannot watch the boy die.' And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation.' Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt." Now it says the child grew, the child, of course, being Isaac, and it came to a point that he was weaned, and on that day, Abraham held a great feast. Now, we really don't know at what age that Isaac was at that time. It doesn't indicate that. But while this great feast was going on, Sarah saw that Ishmael was mocking. And again, it doesn't go into any kind of detail about who he was mocking, how he was mocking, or anything like that. Nevertheless, it upset Sarah to the point that she went to her husband and said, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son." It's interesting the way she referred to them. She's saying, "Get rid of them." You would think that she had had some kind of connection with Ishmael over the 14 years that he had been alive, and would call them by their names, but just trying to kind of depersonalize them. She refers to them as a slave woman and her son, and tells Abraham, "You're going to have to get rid of them." Knowing that to get rid of them was to cast them out on their own, which would lead them to starvation, exposure, possible violence from other people that might come along. And the scripture tells us that Abraham was greatly distressed. And I think we can all understand why he was greatly distressed, because when it's all said and done, Ishmael was his son. And there Sarah was saying, "Get rid of him. Don't want him around anymore." And she even referred to that she didn't want him sharing any kind of inheritance with her son. Of course, speaking about Isaac. So Abraham, he prayed to God. And he looked to God to try to help him resolve the family issues that had presented itself with this demand of Sarah's. Now, it is one thing to say that God wanted Sarah to cast away her servant and Abraham's son. It's another thing to say that God allowed it and saw it as a way to carry out his larger promises for his people. Those larger promises revolved around Isaac, not Ishmael. So God told Abraham to accept the will of his wife. And he says, listen to whatever Sarah tells you. Because remember, it's through Isaac that your descendants will come about, and the great nation that will come from that. So Abraham, it says, early the next morning. Now, I think we can derive from that Abraham was very obedient at this point to God, because he immediately followed his instructions. And it says he gave water and he gave food to Hagar and Ishmael, and then set them out. And it says they wandered off into the desert. Now in verse 13, again, God tells Abraham, "I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." In working with Sarah's decision, God did not ignore Hagar or become indifferent to Ishmael. Although God was always going to fulfill his promises through Sarah's child, he chose to also make Ishmael a nation, because he too was Abraham's son. So they went out, and they were out there in this desert of Beersheba. And you knew this was probably going to happen. They ran out of water. They ate all the food. And at some point, Ishmael became very sick, very weak, became dehydrated. And Scripture tells us that she just took him. I can kind of imagine in my mind, and I think you can too, that maybe he's kind of staggering along and barely able to stay upright. She takes him over and gets him under a bush, trying to provide him some kind of shade from the sun. And then it says she went off away from him, at least a bow shot away. Remember that, because in a few moments we'll kind of tie that back in. And the reason she went off, it says, "I cannot watch the boy die." She began to cry. And you think about it. she knew he was dying. She didn't want to see that happen, and she goes away. God hears the crying, and it says the angel of God called out to Hagar and said, what's the matter? And he also says, don't be afraid. So many times in Bible stories we read of that, where the people are told to do not be afraid. And I picked up this one sentence out of a study Bible of mine. It says, when God calls his people to fear not, he calls them to love him and trust in his plans for them. Because so many times his plans don't exactly coincide with that person's plans. But he says, lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I'll make him into a great nation. Well, obviously for that to happen, he was going to have to live. Then it says God opened Hagar's eyes, and she was able to see a well of water. They were exhausted, dehydrated, any number of reasons why she hadn't noticed the water before. But it does say God opened her eyes, so for some reason she didn't see it previously. So she went, got the water, gave her son water, and he grew up in verse 20. And it says, God was with the boy as he grew up. And he grew up to be an archer. So refer back to a few minutes ago, we were talking about she went a bow shot away from where he was lying under the bush. And then he later became an archer. Kind of interesting, I think. It says Hagar had a difficult life. She definitely did. But as Ishmael's name reminds us, God hears. Abraham's God, who loved both Isaac and Ishmael, is the Lord of all creation. He cares for all people, and he keeps his promises. He hears all cries of injustice, and he responds with a message of hope. That message must be preached, must be taught, it must be lived by his people before the watching world, which is desperate for a better story than the divisions that so often define our lives. When we hear, the world might begin to believe that God also hears. Today's scripture passage shows us that Abraham's life turned around when he chose to obey God under all circumstances and realized that his plans for him were best. God is a God of promises, and he always keeps his promises. He did not abandon his promise to Abraham when Abraham attempted to keep his line going by having a child with a slave woman. The Lord was still faithful to provide through both Isaac and Ishmael, despite Abraham's struggles. Likewise, God will not abandon us. Even when our families, physical families and spiritual families, are in shambles, God proved his love for us through the gift of Jesus. Even when animosity among members of a fractured family runs very high, God's love is constant and unchangeable. In times of personal adversity, we are well-minded to read Jude, the first chapter, 21st verse, which says, keep yourselves in God's love.